Picture this. May 7th, 1840. The Mississippi River flows. Slow, lazy, almost peaceful beneath a spring sky. Flatboats drift along the current, their wooden hulls creaking softly against the docks of Natchez Landing. Steamboat whistles echo across the water. Men shout to one another, hauling cotton bales, laughing, working. Children play near the bluff. Women hang laundry in the warm afternoon breeze. Everything feels normal, safe, routine. But in less than an hour, this river port will become a graveyard. Over 300 people will be dead. Hundreds more will simply vanish. And one of the most powerful tornadoes in American history will carve a path of destruction so complete, so absolute that even today, we're still uncovering the truth about what really happened. This is the story of the Great Natchez Tornado, a disaster almost forgotten by history, a tragedy that struck both land and water, and a warning that nature's fury respects no boundary, no river, no life. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see storms forever. Let me take you back. Natchez, Mississippi, 1840. This isn't just any river town. This is one of the wealthiest, most bustling ports in the entire South. Cotton is king here. Massive plantations stretch across the bluffs on the Mississippi side and across the river in Louisiana's Concordia Parish. More plantations, more fields, more wealth. The town itself sits high on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River. Elegant mansions line the streets. Merchants grow rich, and below, down at the landing, that's where the real action happens. Natchez Landing, they call it Natchez-Under-the-Hill. A chaotic, crowded strip of docks, warehouses, saloons, and boarding houses clinging to the riverbank. On this particular day, May 7th, there are 120 flatboats moored at the landing. 120. These aren't small vessels. These are massive wooden rafts, some over 100 feet long, loaded with goods, manned by rough crews of boatmen who floated down from as far north as Pennsylvania and Ohio. They're waiting to unload, waiting to sell their cargo, waiting to head home. Steamboats too, the Hines, the Prairie, the St. Lawrence, all docked, taking on passengers, loading freight. Hundreds of men work the docks, slaves, free blacks, white laborers, Irish immigrants, all moving in organized chaos. The air smells like river mud, tobacco, sweat, and opportunity. No one suspects what's coming. Close your eyes for a second and imagine the sounds. The slap of water against wooden hulls, the creak of ropes pulling tight, hammers pounding, men cursing, laughing. A steamboat whistle cuts through the noise, sharp and clear. Seagulls cry overhead. It's loud, it's alive, it's busy. This is the heartbeat of commerce in the South. But now, listen closer. Do you hear it? That low rumble in the distance? Thunder. By midday, the weather begins to shift. The sky, which had been clear and blue just hours before, starts to darken. Clouds roll in from the southwest, thick and heavy, the kind that make you glance up and wonder. The air grows still, humid, oppressive. On the plantations outside town, field workers pause, wiping sweat from their brows, looking toward the horizon. Something feels wrong. Down at the landing, a few boatmen glance at the sky, but most keep working. Storms are common in spring. Thunder rumbles again, closer this time. The wind picks up, just a little, rustling through the trees on the bluff. A woman gathering laundry feels a chill and hurries inside. A shopkeeper on the main street looks out his window and frowns. The clouds aren't just dark, they're green, swirling, moving fast, too fast. And then, silence. That eerie, unnatural silence that comes right before nature unleashes hell. What happens when a tornado, a massive tornado, doesn't just hit land, but strikes a river crowded with boats and men? Hold that thought, because we're about to find out. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, roughly 20 miles southwest of Natchez in the forests of Concordia Parish, Louisiana, it begins. A funnel cloud descends from the boiling sky. At first, it's thin, almost delicate, but within seconds it widens and widens and widens. until it's nearly a mile across. Trees, some of them centuries old, are ripped from the ground like weeds. The sound is indescribable, a roar so loud it drowns out thought itself. Witnesses later said it sounded like 1,000 freight trains, like the earth itself was screaming. The tornado moves northeast, following the corridor of the Mississippi River. It doesn't weaken, it doesn't slow, it grows stronger. Fields vanish, plantation cabins explode into splinters. Livestock are lifted into the air and hurled hundreds of feet. And the storm is heading straight for Natchez. Let me show you the path. Starting southwest of Natchez, the tornado tracks northeast for approximately 35 miles. Its width? Nearly 1,000 yards at its peak. That's over half a mile of pure destruction. It moves along both sides of the Mississippi River, stripping forests on the Louisiana side, tearing through plantations, and then it hits the water. Now, here's where this storm becomes unlike almost any other tornado in history. Most tornadoes weaken over water, not this one. This monster thrives. As it crosses the Mississippi River, it doesn't just touch the surface, it churns the water into a frothing, violent chaos. Waves rise 10, 15 feet high. The river itself seems to lift. And those flatboats, those massive heavy wooden vessels moored at Natchez Landing, they don't stand a chance. How many people died on the water versus on land? The answer will shock you. But first, let me take you to the moment of impact. The tornado slams into Natchez Landing with the force of an explosion. 120 flatboats. In the span of minutes, 116 of them are torn from their moorings and hurled into the river. Some flip upside down, some shatter into pieces. Some are lifted entirely out of the water and smashed against the bluff. The men aboard, boatmen who've spent their entire lives on the river, are thrown into the churning water. They try to swim, they try to grab onto debris, but the current is too strong, the waves too high, the wind too violent. They drown, by the dozens, by the hundreds. Witnesses on the bluff, those lucky enough to be above the destruction, watch in horror as men disappear beneath the surface. Some are crushed between colliding boats. Some are impaled by flying timber. Some simply vanish. The steamboat Hines, a proud vessel that had been loading passengers just minutes before, is torn apart. The Prairie is capsized. The St. Lawrence is driven into the bank and destroyed. And the screams of drowning men mix with the roar of the wind until you can't tell one from the other. Listen. The creak of wood under impossible strain, the snap of a mast breaking, the splash of a body hitting water, the desperate gasp of a man going under. This is what the river sounded like that day. But the tornado isn't finished. As it moves inland, it strikes the town of Natchez itself. The Under-the-Hill district, that boar-crowded strip of warehouses and saloons and boarding houses, is obliterated. Buildings that have stood for decades are reduced to rubble in seconds. Brick walls collapse. Roofs are peeled off like paper. Chimneys, massive structures of brick and mortar, are lifted into the air and hurled hundreds of feet. One chimney is later found embedded in the ground over a quarter-mile away. People inside their homes have no warning, no time to run. They're crushed beneath falling beams, buried under collapsing walls. A woman named Mrs. Alexander is found in the wreckage, clutching her 2 children. Somehow, miraculously, all 3 survive. But around them, dozens don't. A local newspaper will later write, "Our devoted city is in ruins. All is swept away." And they're not exaggerating. Entire blocks are gone. The streets are unrecognizable, choked with debris, with bodies, with the shattered remnants of lives. But here's the thing. As devastating as the destruction in town is, as horrific as the loss of life on land, the worst is still coming. Because the river, the Mississippi River, is about to become the deadliest theater of this entire disaster. And the true death toll, we're only just beginning to understand it. Let's talk numbers. 120 flatboats at Natchez Landing, 116 destroyed. Each flatboat carried a crew of anywhere from 5 to 15 men. Do the math. That's potentially over 1,000 men on the water when the tornado hit. How many survived? We don't know exactly. But we do know this. The official death toll lists at least 200 boatmen drowned. 200. And that's almost certainly an undercount. Why? Because many of these men were transient workers. They had no families in Natchez. No one to report them missing. No one to claim their bodies. Some were never found. Their bodies swept downriver, lost forever in the muddy current. Others were found days later, miles downstream, bloated and unrecognizable. The river became a mass grave. And here's the truly haunting part. In the days after the storm, boats traveling downriver reported seeing bodies floating in the water for weeks. But wait, if 200 boatmen died on the river, and the official death toll is 317, where did the other 100+ deaths come from? The answer lies across the river. On the plantations. And it's a story that history tried to bury. Imagine you're reading a newspaper from May 1840. The headlines scream about the disaster. Terrible tornado! Natchez in ruins! Hundreds dead! But if you read closely, you'll notice something. The articles focus almost entirely on the town, on the river, on the white victims. There's barely a mention of what happened across the river in Louisiana, barely a mention of the plantations, and almost no mention of the slaves. Here's what really happened. On the Louisiana side of the river, in Concordia Parish, the tornado tore through multiple plantations. These weren't just fields of cotton. These were communities, slave quarters, rows of small wooden cabins where hundreds of enslaved people lived. When the tornado hit, those cabins didn't just collapse, they exploded. Witnesses described entire structures being lifted into the air and disintegrating. The people inside, men, women, children, had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They were killed instantly, crushed, impaled by flying debris, swept away. And here's the cruelest part. Their deaths were barely recorded. Why? Because in 1840, enslaved people weren't considered people. Not in official records, not in death tolls. They were property. And when property was destroyed, it was noted as a financial loss, not a human tragedy. One plantation owner later filed an insurance claim for lost property that included buildings, livestock, and slaves. No names, no ages, just numbers. So, when we say the official death toll was 317, understand that number is incomplete. It counts the white residents of Natchez. It counts some of the boatmen, but it barely scratches the surface of the enslaved people who died. Modern historians estimate the true death toll could be as high as 500, maybe more. We'll never know for sure, because their names were never written down, their lives were never counted, and their stories were almost lost to history. So, why was this storm so deadly? Why did it kill so many people compared to other tornadoes? The answer lies in a perfect storm of factors, and understanding them might just save lives today. Let me show you something. This is a map of the tornado's path, starting here, 20 miles southwest of Natchez, moving northeast, 35 miles long, up to 1,000 yards wide at its peak. Now, most tornadoes follow a relatively straight path over land. This one, it followed the river. It moved along the Mississippi River corridor, striking both banks. And here's the key. It maintained its strength over water. That's extremely rare. Water usually disrupts a tornado's circulation. But this storm was so powerful, so well organized, that the river didn't weaken it. If anything, the moisture from the river may have fueled it. Modern meteorologists estimate this tornado would have been rated an F4, possibly even an F5 on the Fujita scale, winds exceeding 200 miles per hour. Capable of leveling even well-built structures. And remember, this is 1840. There are no weather satellites, no radar, no warning systems. No one knows this storm is coming until it's literally on top of them. So, let's break down why this tornado was so catastrophic. Factor 1, timing. It hit in the middle of the day, around 1 p.m., when the landing was at its busiest. If it had struck at night, fewer boats would have been moored. Fewer people would have been on the docks. But midday, maximum casualties. Factor 2, location. Natchez Landing was a death trap. Crowded, built on low ground right at the river's edge, with nowhere to run, nowhere to take shelter. When the tornado hit, people were trapped between the storm and the water. Factor 3, the boats themselves. Flatboats were massive but fragile. They weren't designed to withstand wind. They had no engines, no way to maneuver. They were sitting ducks. Factor 4, the path over water. This is the big one. By striking the river directly, the tornado didn't just destroy buildings. It created a maritime disaster. Drowning became the primary cause of death. And Factor 5, the hidden victims. The enslaved people on the plantations had no agency, no ability to seek shelter, no voice to demand help. They were the most vulnerable, and they paid the highest price. But not everyone died. Some people survived. Some even became heroes. So, who were they? And how did they make it through? Let me tell you about Mrs. Alexander. When the tornado hit, she was at home with her 2 young children. The house began to shake. The windows shattered. She grabbed her children and tried to run, but before she could reach the door, the roof collapsed. Beams fell, walls caved in. She was buried under rubble, her children trapped beneath her. For hours she lay there in the darkness, barely able to breathe, listening to the screams of others, the groans of the injured, the eerie silence that followed. Rescuers found her late that evening. Somehow, impossibly, she and both children were alive, bruised, bleeding, but alive. Then there's the story of a boatman named William. No last name recorded, just William. He was on one of the flatboats when the tornado struck. The boat flipped. He was thrown into the water. He couldn't swim well. Most boatmen couldn't. But he grabbed onto a piece of debris, a shattered plank, and held on. The current dragged him downriver. The wind battered him, but he held on. For over an hour he clung to that plank, until finally, miles downstream, he washed ashore. He walked back to Natchez 2 days later, barefoot, half-starved, but alive. And then, there are the stories we don't have. The enslaved people who survived but whose names were never recorded. The children who lost their parents. The families torn apart. Their stories exist only in fragments, in whispers, in the gaps of history. Imagine the moment after the storm passed. The wind stops, the roar fades, and all that's left is silence, broken only by the sound of water dripping, timber creaking, and the soft, desperate cries of the wounded. The scene in Natchez after the tornado is almost beyond description. The Under-the-Hill district is gone. Just gone. Where buildings stood, there's now only rubble. The docks are shattered. Flatboats lie in pieces, scattered across the riverbank like broken toys. Bodies are everywhere. Some are visible, trapped under debris. Others are hidden, buried deep in the wreckage. The smell of death begins to rise in the humid air. Survivors wander through the ruins in shock, calling out names, searching for loved ones. A local minister later wrote, "The air was black with whirling eddies of everything. The river rose in a mound, and the boats were engulfed." Rescue efforts begin almost immediately, but they're chaotic, disorganized. There are no emergency services, no hospitals as we know them today. Doctors work by candlelight, amputating limbs, stitching wounds, trying desperately to save lives with limited supplies. The injured groan in makeshift shelters. And the dead. The dead are laid out in rows, waiting to be identified, waiting to be buried. But there aren't enough coffins. There isn't enough time. Mass graves are dug. And by the end of the week, over 300 bodies, at least the ones that were found, are buried. Many without names, many without mourners, just gone. But the story doesn't end with the rubble. It doesn't end with the burials, because the legacy of the Great Natchez Tornado, the way it shaped this town, the way it exposed the darkest truths of the time, the way it still haunts the Mississippi River, that legacy lives on. And if you want to understand why this disaster matters, why it still matters today, you need to hear what comes next, and I promise you, it's going to make you see history and storms in a completely different light. In the days immediately following May 7th, 1840, Natchez becomes a city of ghosts. The living move through the ruins like sleepwalkers, their faces blank with shock, their hands trembling as they dig through debris. But here's something remarkable about human nature. Even in the face of absolute devastation, even when everything seems lost, people rebuild. They have to. Within hours of the tornado passing, survivors begin organizing rescue efforts. Men form chains, passing rubble hand to hand, searching for anyone still alive beneath the wreckage. Women set up makeshift hospitals in the few buildings still standing. The churches, those that survived, open their doors to the homeless, the injured, the orphaned. Plantation owners from outside the affected area send wagons of supplies, food, water, medical equipment. And yes, they send slaves. Enslaved people are forced to dig through the ruins, to pull bodies from the wreckage, to bury the dead in mass graves, their own dead, their own families, without time to mourn, without recognition, without rest. One account describes enslaved workers laboring for 72 hours straight, digging, hauling, burying, while their owners supervised from a distance. The irony is crushing. The same people who were considered property, who weren't even counted in the death toll, were the ones tasked with cleaning up the disaster. So, how is this storm remembered today? And more importantly, how much of the story has been forgotten, buried just like those unnamed victims? The answer might surprise you. Let me take you forward in time. Natchez, Mississippi, today. If you visit, you'll find a beautiful historic town. Antebellum mansions line the streets, carefully preserved, open for tours. The bluff overlooks the Mississippi River, just as it did in 1840. Tourists come to see the Old South, to walk through grand homes, to imagine what life was like before the Civil War. But if you ask about the tornado, most people draw a blank. There's a small historical marker near the landing, a plaque, easy to miss. It mentions the date, the death toll, a few basic facts, but it doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't mention the enslaved victims. It doesn't describe the maritime disaster. It doesn't capture the scale of what happened. And that's the tragedy of memory. Some stories get told over and over until they become legend. Others fade into silence. The Natchez Historical Society has worked for years to preserve what records exist. Old newspaper clippings, yellowed and fragile, eyewitness accounts written in shaky handwriting, insurance claims, death certificates, at least for those who got them. But there are gaps, huge gaping holes in this historical record. The enslaved victims, most have no names attached to them, no ages, no stories, just estimates. Approximately 50 slaves lost on the Johnson plantation. Numerous Negro casualties reported. That's it. The boatmen? Many were transient workers, drifters, men who'd floated down from Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky. They had no permanent addresses, no next of kin in Natchez. When they died, there was no one to write home to, no one to memorialize them. They simply disappeared from history. And the town itself? Natchez rebuilt quickly. Within a year, new buildings stood where the old ones had been destroyed. The landing reopened, flatboats returned, commerce resumed, life went on, because it had to. But in that rush to rebuild, to move forward, to forget the trauma, the memory of the tornado began to fade. By the time of the Civil War, just 20 years later, the tornado was already becoming a footnote. And by the 20th century, most Americans had never even heard of it. Here's something that should shock you. The Great Natchez Tornado of 1840 is the second deadliest tornado in United States history. Second, only the Tri-State Tornado of 1925, which killed 695 people across Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana, has a higher death toll. Think about that. We remember the Tri-State Tornado. It's taught in schools, documented in detail, commemorated with memorials. But Natchez? Barely a footnote. Why? Part of it is timing. The Tri-State Tornado happened in the age of photography, of modern record-keeping, of mass media. The Natchez Tornado happened in 1840, when documentation was sparse, when many victims weren't considered worth recording. Part of it is location. The Tri-State Tornado hit multiple states, affected a wider area, generated more national attention. Natchez was a single town, a regional disaster, easier to forget. and part of it is who died. The tri-state tornado killed mostly white farmers and townspeople. The Natchez tornado killed boatmen, transient workers, and enslaved people. In the hierarchy of whose lives mattered in historical memory, Natchez didn't make the cut, but it should. Because this storm was every bit as devastating, every bit as significant, and the lessons it teaches are just as relevant today. So here's a question. What if a storm like this hit today? Could we handle it? Would we be ready? Or are we just as vulnerable as those people in 1840? Let's talk about what's changed. Today we have the National Weather Service. We have Doppler radar that can detect rotation in storms from miles away. We have tornado warnings that give people precious minutes to take shelter. We have building codes designed to withstand high winds. We have emergency response systems, trained first responders, hospitals equipped for mass casualties. All of that would make a huge difference. But here's the uncomfortable truth. If a tornado like the Natchez storm, an F4 or F5, struck a modern river port with no warning, people would still die. Because you can't outrun a tornado. You can't outbuild an F5. And if you're on the water, on a boat, with nowhere to go, you're just as vulnerable as those flatboatmen in 1840. Modern river ports, places like New Orleans, Memphis, St. Louis, they're still crowded with vessels, still hubs of commerce. And while we have better warning systems, we don't have perfect ones. Tornadoes can form quickly, sometimes in minutes. And if one formed over a river, if it struck during peak traffic, the death toll could still be catastrophic. That's the lesson of Natchez. Nature doesn't care about our technology. Nature doesn't care about our preparedness. When a storm of that magnitude hits, all we can do is survive. Modern meteorologists have studied the Natchez tornado extensively, trying to understand exactly what made it so powerful. The consensus? It was a supercell thunderstorm, the kind that produces the most violent tornadoes. The atmospheric conditions that day were perfect warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico colliding with cooler, drier air from the north. Strong wind shear, the change in wind speed and direction with altitude, created rotation. And once that rotation tightened into a funnel, it became a monster. The fact that it maintained its strength over the Mississippi River is particularly fascinating. Most tornadoes weaken over water because the surface is cooler and there's less friction to maintain the circulation. But the Mississippi in May is warm, fed by spring runoff, and the river itself is so wide, over a mile in some places, that it may have acted almost like land. The moisture from the river may have actually fueled the storm, giving it more energy. And the path, following the river corridor, meant the tornado had a natural channel to follow, a path of least resistance. It's a perfect storm scenario, literally. And it's a reminder that tornadoes don't follow rules. They don't behave predictably. They can strike anywhere, anytime, and when they do. The results can be catastrophic. But let's get back to the human cost. Because beyond the numbers, beyond the meteorology, beyond the historical analysis, there are people, real people, with names, with families, with stories, and so many of them have been lost to history. So, who were they? The boatmen, the slaves, the uncounted victims? And why does it matter that we remember them? Let me tell you about someone we'll never know. A young enslaved woman, maybe 20 years old, working on a plantation in Concordia Parish. We don't know her name. We don't know what she looked like. We don't know if she had children, if she had a husband, if she dreamed of freedom. All we know is that on May 7th, 1840, she was in one of the slave cabins when the tornado hit, and she died. Her body was probably buried in an unmarked grave, along with dozens of others. No funeral, no headstone, no record, just gone. Multiply that story by 100, by 200, and you begin to understand the scale of the invisible tragedy. These weren't just numbers. These were people. People who laughed, who cried, who loved, who suffered. People whose lives mattered, even if history didn't record them. And the boatmen? Think about a man named John. Let's call him John, from Pennsylvania. He spent months building a flatboat, loading it with goods, floating down the Ohio River, then the Mississippi, all the way to Natchez. It was his livelihood, his future. He was planning to sell his cargo, sell the boat for lumber, and used the money to buy land back home. Maybe he had a wife waiting for him, maybe children. We don't know. Because when the tornado hit, when his boat capsized and he drowned in the churning water, no one was there to tell his story. No one wrote home. His family probably waited for months, wondering why he never returned. And eventually, they stopped waiting. These are the lost voices of Natchez. The people who history forgot, and it's our responsibility today to remember them, to say their names, even if we don't know them, to acknowledge that they existed, that they mattered, that their deaths were a tragedy. Because if we don't, who will? There are physical remnants of the tornado that lasted for decades. Witnesses reported that trees along the tornado's path were stripped completely bare, not just of leaves, but of bark, of branches, reduced to pale, skeletal trunks. And here's the eerie part. Those trees never fully recovered. 80 years later, in the 1920s, people could still identify the tornado's path by looking at the tree line. The forest on either side was lush and green. But along the path, the trees were stunted, twisted, scarred, a permanent scar on the landscape. And then there are the artifacts. A piece of a steamboat window was found 30 miles downriver, embedded in the bank. 30 miles. Think about the force required to carry a piece of glass that far without shattering it. Personal belongings, letters, clothing, tools were found scattered across the countryside for weeks after the storm. One family found a child's doll lodged in the branches of a tree on their property. They had no idea where it came from. Whose child had held that doll? Was she alive, or had she died in the storm? They never found out. These haunting remnants, these physical echoes of the disaster, serve as a reminder. The tornado may have passed in minutes, but its impact lasted lifetimes. The wind has moved on. The river flows calm again. The town has rebuilt. But the questions remain. What does this disaster teach us? Why does it still matter? Nearly 200 years later, and what can we learn from the voices that were silenced? Stay with me, because the final chapter of this story is the most important one. Let's step back for a moment. One day, one storm, one tornado, and over 300 lives, probably closer to 500, gone. Families destroyed, a town shattered, an entire community traumatized, all in the span of less than an hour. That's the power of nature. We like to think we're in control. We build cities, we dam rivers, we predict the weather. We create the illusion of safety, of mastery over the natural world. But then something like the Natchez tornado happens, and we're reminded, brutally, that we're not in control. We never were. Nature operates on a scale, with a power that dwarfs anything we can create. And when it decides to unleash that power, all we can do is endure. The people of Natchez in 1840 had no warning, no radar, no sirens, no weather apps. But even today, with all our technology, we're still vulnerable. Tornadoes still kill, hurricanes still devastate, floods still destroy, because nature doesn't negotiate, it doesn't compromise, it simply is. And the lesson of Natchez is this: respect it. Prepare for it, but never, ever underestimate it. Look at this image, an old photograph, faded, cracked, barely visible. It shows the Mississippi River, calm and wide, reflecting the sky. On the bank, a few buildings, a dock, a flatboat. It could be any day, any year, but somewhere in that water, beneath that calm surface, are the ghosts of hundreds of men who drowned on May 7th, 1840. You can't see them, but they're there. So, what can the Natchez tornado teach us today? First, the importance of warning systems. In 1840, people had no idea the storm was coming. Today we have the technology to detect tornadoes, to warn people, to save lives. But that technology only works if people listen, if they take warnings seriously, if they have a plan. Too many people ignore tornado warnings, thinking, it won't happen to me. The people of Natchez thought the same thing. Second, the vulnerability of water-based communities, river ports, coastal cities, anywhere that combines dense population with water. These are high-risk areas, and we need to plan accordingly. Better evacuation routes, better shelters, better emergency response. Third, and this is crucial, we need to remember all the victims, not just the ones who were considered important at the time, not just the ones whose names were recorded, all of them, the enslaved people who died on the plantations, the transient boatmen who drowned in the river, the children, the elderly, the forgotten. Because every life matters, every death is a tragedy, and if we only remember some victims, if we only tell some stories, we're repeating the injustice of history. Let me end with one more story. In Natchez today, there's a small cemetery on the bluff overlooking the river. It's old, dating back to the early 1800s, with weathered headstones and moss-covered monuments. And in one corner, there's a mass grave, no individual markers. Just a single stone that reads, Victims of the Great Tornado, May 7th, 1840. Every year, on May 7th, a few people gather there, descendants of survivors, local historians, people who care about preserving memory. They hold a small ceremony. They read the names of the known victims, and then they observe a moment of silence for the unknown ones, the slaves, the boatmen, the lost. It's a small gesture, but it matters. Because remembering is an act of resistance against forgetting. Telling these stories is an act of justice for those who were silenced, and acknowledging the past, with all its pain and complexity, is the only way we can hope to build a better future. One woman who attends every year is named Sarah. Her great-great-great-grandfather was a boatman who survived the tornado. He was on one of the 4 flatboats that didn't capsize. He watched his friends drown. He spent the rest of his life haunted by what he saw. And he made his descendants promise that they would never forget, that they would tell the story, that they would honor the dead. Sarah keeps that promise, and in doing so, she keeps the memory of May 7th, 1840, alive. Some things we cannot unsee. The cost of that day, the 317 official deaths, the hundreds more uncounted, the silence of the river which swallowed so many and gave back so few, the lost names, the forgotten faces, the stories that almost disappeared. We cannot unsee them. We cannot unhear their voices, and we shouldn't try. Because in remembering, we honor them. In telling their stories, we give them back their humanity. And in learning from their tragedy, we protect ourselves and future generations from repeating it. When you look at the Mississippi River today, you see a mighty waterway, commerce, beauty, history. But if you know the story of May 7th, 1840, you see something else. You see the ghosts of flatboats tossed like toys in a child's bath. You see the faces of men gasping for air as the water closes over them. You see the slave cabins exploding into splinters. You see the town of Natchez, proud and prosperous, reduced to rubble in minutes. And you hear the wind, that terrible roaring wind that changed everything. The Great Natchez Tornado is more than a historical footnote. It's a testament to nature's power, a reminder of human vulnerability, and a call to remember those who history tried to forget. 317 lives, officially. Hundreds more, unofficially. Each one a person, each one a story, each one worth remembering. So the next time you see a storm rolling in, the next time you hear a tornado warning, the next time you stand on the banks of a river and feel the wind pick up, remember Natchez, remember May 7th, 1840, and remember that nature, for all its beauty, can be absolutely, terrifyingly merciless. The ghosts of the Mississippi still whisper in the currents, and if we listen closely, we can hear them, telling us to prepare, telling us to remember, telling us that it could happen again. The Great Natchez Tornado, May 7th, 1840. Over 300 dead, hundreds more forgotten. A town destroyed. A river turned into a graveyard, and a story that must never be forgotten. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if it taught you something, if it made you think, that's how we honor the dead. That's how we learn from the past. And that's how we prepare for whatever storms may come.